Throughout the recorded history of civilization, the instinctual constraint enforced by scarcity has been intensified by constraints enforced by the hierarchical distribution of scarcity and labor. The interest of domination added surplus repression to the organization of the instincts under the reality principle. The pleasure principle was dethroned not only because it militated against progress in civilization, but also because it militated against a civilization whose progress perpetuates domination and toil. Freud seems to acknowledge this fact when he compares the attitude of civilization toward sexuality with that of a tribe or a section of the population, which has gained the upper hand and is exploiting the rest to its own advantage. Fear of a revolt among the oppressed then becomes a motive for even stricter regulations. End quote. The modification of the instincts under the reality principle affects the life instinct as well as the death instinct, but the development of the latter becomes fully understandable only in the light of the development of the life instinct, that is, of the repressive organization of sexuality. The sex instincts bear the brunt of the reality principle. Their organization culminates in the subjection of the partial sex instincts to the primacy of genitality, and in their subjugation under the function of procreation. The process involves the diversion of libido from one's own body toward an alien object of the opposite sex, the mastery of primary and secondary narcissism. The gratification of the partial instincts and of the non-procreative genitality are, according to the degree of their independence, tabooed as perversions, sublimated, or transformed into subsidiaries of procreative sexuality. Moreover, the latter is in most civilizations channeled into monogamic institutions. This organization results in a quantitative and qualitative restriction of sexuality. The unification of the partial instincts and their subjugation under the procreative function alter the very nature of sexuality. From an autonomous principle governing the entire organism, it is turned into a specialized temporary function, into a means for an end. In terms of the pleasure principle governing the unorganized sex instincts, reproduction is merely a byproduct. The primary content of sexuality is the function of obtaining pleasure from zones of the body. This function is only subsequently brought into the service of that of reproduction. Freud emphasizes time and again that without its organization for such service, sexuality would preclude all non-sexual and therefore all civilized societal relations, even at the stage of mature heterosexual genitality. Quote, "The conflict between civilization and sexuality is caused by the circumstance that sexual love is a relationship between two people, in which a third can only be superfluous or disturbing, whereas civilization is founded on relations between larger groups of persons. When a love relationship is at its height, no room is left for any interest in the surrounding world. The pair of lovers are sufficient unto themselves, do not even need the child they have in common to make them happy." End quote. And earlier, in arguing the distinction between sexual and self-preservation instincts, he points up the fatal implications of sexuality. Quote, "It is undeniable that the exercise of this function does not always bring advantage to the individual, as do his other activities, but that for the sake of an exceptionally high degree of pleasure, he is involved by this function in dangers which jeopardize his life and often enough exact it." End quote. But how does this interpretation of sexuality as an essentially explosive force in conflict with civilization justify the definition of Eros as the effort to combine organic substances into even larger unities, to establish ever greater unities and to preserve them thus, in short, to bind together? End quote. How can sexuality become the probable substitute for the instinct towards perfection, the power that holds together everything in the world? How does the notion of the asocial character of sexuality jibe with the supposition that love relationships, or to use a more neutral expression, emotional ties, also constitute the essence of the group mind? End quote. The apparent contradiction is not solved by attributing the explosive connotations to the earlier concept of sexuality and the constructive ones to Eros, for the latter includes both. In Civilization and its Discontents, immediately following the passage quoted above, Freud joins the two aspects. Quote, "In no other case does Eros so plainly betray the core of his being, his aim of making one out of many, but when he has achieved it in the proverbial way through the love of two human beings, he is not willing to go further." End quote. Nor can the contradiction be eliminated by locating the constructive cultural force of Eros only in the sublimated modes of sexuality. According to Freud, the drive toward even ever larger unities belongs to the biological organic nature of Eros itself. At this stage of our interpretation, rather than trying to reconcile the two contradictory aspects of sexuality, we suggest that they reflect the inner unreconciled tension in Freud's theory, against his notion of the inevitable, biological, conflict between pleasure principle and reality principle, between sexuality and civilization, militates the idea of the unifying and gratifying power of Eros, chained and worn out in a sick civilization. The idea would imply that the free Eros does not preclude lasting civilized societal relationships, that it repels only the super repressive organization of societal relationships under a principle which is the negation of the pleasure principle. Freud allows himself the image of a civilization consisting of pairs of individuals libidinally satisfied in each other, and linked to all the others by work and common interest. End quote. But he adds that such a desirable state does not exist and never has existed, that culture exacts a heavy toll of aim-inhibited libido, and heavy restrictions upon sexual life are unavoidable. End quote. He finds the reason for culture's antagonism to sexuality in the aggressive instincts deeply fused with sexuality. They threaten time and again to destroy civilization, and they force culture to call up every possible reinforcement against them. Hence, its system of methods by which mankind is to be driven to identifications and aim-inhibited love relationships, hence the restrictions on sexual life. End quote. But again, Freud shows that this repressive system does not really solve the conflict. Civilization plunges into a destructive dialectic. The perpetual restrictions on Eros ultimately weaken the life instincts and thus strengthen and release the very forces against which they were called up, those of destruction. This dialectic, which constitutes the still unexplored and even tabooed core of Freud's metapsychology, will be explored later on. Here we shall use Freud's antagonistic conception of Eros for elucidating the specific historical mode of repressiveness imposed by the established reality principle.